Hello and welcome to the SANHS webinar. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm the chair of SANHS. This evening, John Page will be talking about Chantries. John is a long-standing member of SANHS, having joined the Society in the 1970s as part of the Historic Buildings Committee. Later, he joined the Library Committee and the Local History Committee, which until recently he chaired for the last 20 years. John's a really busy person. He represents SANHS on the Axbridge Town Trust, and for about 20 years he's chaired the Axbridge Museum, as well as being a founding member of the Banwell Heritage Group. He gives talks to organisations all over the southwest, writes local history articles for his local village newsletter, and has published some books and articles. This talk discusses Chantries from their origin to the Reformation and then looks at their legacy since that time. It concentrates on the financing of Chantries, an aspect less frequently discussed, but for the archives of Axbridge provide a wealth of information. That archive is owned by the Axbridge Town Trust, which, since its inception in the late 19th century, has always had a member of the SANHS committee of SANHS on its committee to advise on maintenance of its archive and the ancient artefacts. John has for many years acted as our representative, so has had a golden opportunity to study the wealth of information that they contain. As usual, John will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be gratefully appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to you, John.
Good evening, everybody. I hope that's got the screen up. And right, where are we? So, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Lizzie. Yes, so my talk is called Chantries and Their Legacies. Most online references to Chantries state that there are two types. The first is a chapel where chantries are performed. And in 2018, Jerry Sampson gave an excellent talk to SANHS on this very subject. So there's no way I can do better than his performance, and so I'm not going to even try on that one. But the second is for a chantry service, and that's normally performed in a chantry chapel. Again, that has many discussions elsewhere, and that's it. Lizzie mentioned in the introduction, I'm therefore going to concentrate on one aspect that doesn't get so much discussion, the financing of chantries. These can be individual payments or trust funds for employing one or more priests to sing services for the benefit of a deceased person's soul. Usually the donor who set up the chantry in his will and members of his family. It will have a particular reference to Axbridge, and my reason for stating that is that that town has one of the best archives in all of Somerset, and the reason for that has a lot to do with chantries, as we shall discuss later on. Also, of course, because I've studied them more closely than any others, makes it a lot easier for me. But naturally, like everything else, chantries are not always handled in a proper fashion, or were not always handled that way, so there were abuses as well as uses. In England, the Reformation banned chantries, and many assets of the organisations running them were acquired by the Crown. That didn't happen in Axbridge, so there's an interesting legacy to explore as to how its former guild members, who were also burgesses, that'll be discussed later, managed to secure the assets, and as to what happened to them over the next few centuries. Most of those assets related to properties, both within the town itself, but also from some of the villages around, and even one or two places that are a bit further away. As it suggests here, they provided the town with some substantial benefits, but they were also the cause of some considerable conflicts within the town at various times. So shown here is a relevant 13th century deed that I will return to later. First, let's look at the origin of chantries. It was only in the late 11th century that the concept of purgatory as a special place was originated. Saints may go straight to heaven when they die. Sinners would go straight to hell. But those in God's grace will enter heaven eventually after they have purged their sins in purgatory. Now, it turned out that this process could be speeded up if those left behind on earth pray for them and obtain indulgences for them. So in 1274, the Second Council of Lyon explained this, that if truly penitent, they die in charity before having by fruits of penance rendered satisfaction for what they have done by commission or omission, their souls are purged after their death by purgatorial or purifactory penalties, and that for the alleviation of these penalties, they are served by the suffrages of the living faithful, to wit, the sacrifice of the mass, prayers, alms, and other works of piety that the faithful customarily offer on behalf of others of the faithful according to the institutions of the church. Now, this is illustrated in a very early wall painting in St. Peter and St. Paul Church in Chaldon in Surrey, and it's known as the Purgatorial Ladder. I just happen to think that this one was rather a nice one. And it shows a ladder on which the faithful who've purged their sins climb up to heaven, whilst those who fail to do so tumble down to hell. And in purgatory, St. Michael is weighing people's souls whilst the devil attempts to tip the balance his way. Some further depictions of this. One comes from the Les Très Riches Heures de Duc de Berry, showing purified souls in purgatory, with souls doing penance trapped in fire, water, on rocky and grassy land, from where those selected are rescued by angels. It's shown up here. Where are we? There. And the bottom right has some beasts surrounding somebody here. And I'm not quite sure whether those are supposed to be devils or something. But on the other side, we have Dante's Purgatorio, where I quite like this one. You've got 7 levels there. You climb up in purgatory, each one of those representing the 7 deadly sins. And as you can see at the top is paradise. Notably, a local bishop named Savaric is recorded as the first person to provide endowments so that those left behind would pray for his soul. And you can see from there that he was Bishop of Bath and Glastonbury. That's actually something that's not terribly well known, perhaps, but I did discuss that story in more detail in another SANHS talk earlier, so I'm not going to go into a lot of that now. On the other hand, when he did actually become Bishop of Glastonbury as well as Bath, he did so by using an army to enter the Glastonbury there, and so he definitely, I think, is the sort of person who needed a lot of prayers said for his souls afterwards. And of course, God didn't notice that he was paying people to pray for him. However, that did start a major trend whereby many people left money or some form of endowment to ensure prayers were said for their soul. And if I can get at there we go. Now here is an early Axbridge example, the one I showed you earlier, of a smallish endowment. It's undated, but probably from the early 13th century, so not long after the death of Savaric. It's a piece of land which only refers to its 2 neighbours as identification. No street name is mentioned. Everyone at the time, of course, would have known exactly where it was just from the names of the people. And a rental of halfpenny, as you can see at the bottom there, is to be given to the Blessed Virgin Mary in the church. That, if you take it in modern money, is about 0.2p, but of course worth a lot more then. As the Guild uses that name of the Blessed Virgin Mary, it almost certainly went to them, though it doesn't explicitly state it is for prayers to be said for the souls of anyone. Also in this document is that, as this is held in the Axbridge archive, it does mean that the property itself came into the hands of the Guild later. Up there actually is a little something that you might notice on there. It's called Maypare. The M has rather got a little bit of rubbing out down on it. There's obviously a substitute name on there, and I mentioned that because the next thing I'm going to show on here, it's got an S in front of his name, Scipia, rather than an M in front of it. But he actually gifts this property to John Gill. Still no street name, but the neighbours are the same. And notably, that mention of a rental to the Virgin Mary has now disappeared. So presumably, on this change, it didn't actually continue. But we've got another deed, and you notice that this one at the top says that it's in length 140 feet and in width 28 feet. We've got another deed in 1390, which actually talks there about Henry Anglesey giving it to John Snell and John Reeve, who were Guild stewards. Now, as this is the only other deed mentioning 140 feet and 28 feet, I'm assuming that it might be the same one, although for some reason or other we don't have the deeds that connect between John Gill and Henry Anglesey on there. That could be because, unfortunately, with the Axbridge deeds, some of them, I think, over time have been lost. And it's very difficult to know whether that is sort of fairly modern or whether that is sometime in the past. They haven't always been looked after properly, unfortunately, which is one of the reasons why I made sure that they all went down to the record office now. So if anybody does want to have a look at any of these deeds, that's where they actually are now. They had been kept in the Axbridge Town Hall. But I haven't been able to trace this one all the way through at the moment, but I hope to do that sometime. And so that actually then comes into the hands of the stewards for the Guild, and therefore is now something there. Presumably, prayers will be said for the souls. Here are a few additional early deeds, this time early and middle 14th century. This time, they're not ones that the Guild ever acquired. They come from the British Library, and here the amounts granted are a little bit larger. So we've got one that says 8p, another one 3 shillings, another 6p. 3 shillings is, of course, 15p today. So it's not even in today's money, not a lot of money, but in those days, a reasonable sum. They're all gifts, which is probably why the rentals are going to the Chantry of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So in other words, that they're paying a sum of money there as a sort of part of their rental. And it's also notable they now refer explicitly to the Chantry, though they make no mention of prayers actually being said for the souls of the dead. There. Actually, I may want to. Better. So I'm having a little bit of problem with something popping up on my screen there. That's better. In this, here we are. Sorry, the will of Stephen Sippers, another item from the British Library. And whereas John Jerden, late vicar of the church called La Temple of Bristol, bequeathed certain lands and goods in Axbridge in his will to the said Stephen, and charged him. Oh, what's happening there? There we are. Sorry about that. And charged him to make 3 chantries in a year, which chantries, on account of the poverty of the priests, have been neglected. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means. It does seem to suggest that the monies that he left on there have been used for other purposes rather than for looking after the chantries as they were supposed to be. And therefore Stephen wills that the land be valued and the money received for the said lands and goods be expended on the said chantries. And whereas the ancient rent assigned for the service of St. Mary in the Church of Axbridge is not sufficient to the support yearly of one priest, Stephen bequeaths a tenement which he purchased and a moorhay which he purchased from Henry de Lee to the Reven commonalty of Axbridge to pay for a chaplain yearly in the said Church of St. Mary. So it looks as though some shenanigans have gone on here without actually explicitly stating what has actually happened on there. Henry de Lee is often mentioned in the Axbridge deeds, but always as a witness. So I assume he's a Burgess on there. But there's no mention of him in there selling anything to Stephen Tripp. Stephen Tripp doesn't appear in any record from the Axbridge archive, although there is a Robert and a John Tripp, who seem to be frequent witnesses. So I'm not quite sure what happened to the tenement and moorhay there. They obviously didn't get into the archive, so presumably, again, what is happening is that some money is being sent from there without the actual deeds being passed across there. So going back to items which are recorded, in this example from 1379, it's not a property which is the basis for a rental to the chantry, but a stall in the marketplace. And it's interesting there that perhaps that somebody from Banwell should have come across to Axbridge to run a stall, demonstrating the importance of the town in this period. Between the 13th and the 15th century, Axbridge became very wealthy due to its role as a local centre for the wool trade. And of course, you notice in this one, actually, it does have amongst the witnesses shown in the bottom right-hand corner there, Martinsea on there and Anglesey, some of the names that we have already mentioned on there. So the guild may have started as a religious guild handling chantry bequest, but it evolved from the 32 burgesses of Doomsday into the stewards and confraternity of the Blessed Mary, and to all extents and purposes became the government of the town for all legal purposes, other than those matters handled by the port reeve, or town reeve, as that means, who acted for the lord of the manor, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and originally held the view of Prankbridge. But originally the burgesses were freemen of a borough, coming from the Latin burgus, a fortress. And Axbridge was originally a fortress, a burh, created to protect the royal palace at Cheddar from the Vikings after Alfred's victory over them. And there were 32 burgle plots, leading to 32 burgesses, probably created under King Athelstan, who were granted control of the town. Notably, the stewards of the guild and the burgesses did seem to bear quite a strong similarity, as we shall see a bit later on as well. The steward's duties would include running the markets and fairs and other civic businesses. They acquired a guild hall in the square, shown in this mid-18th century picture as the building with the columns through the market cross. Interestingly, inside the guild hall is a wall painting, which is shown on the right-hand side of this picture here. When John Post was actually living in the old guild hall there, as he did for a few years, he actually got somebody to come along and a couple of experts to come and have a look at this. And one of them looked at it from the point of view of the painting, and another one came and looked at it from the point of view of the dress and things of that sort. So one dated it to 1390 and the other one dated it to 1410. So let's say around 1400. So it looks as though the guild hall must have been built around that sort of time. Oh, come on, what's this? So I keep getting a little thing coming up on my screen that is blocking my access to the next screen. That's it. This deed here from 1381 explicitly states that it's being given to the stewards of the guild. It refers to a messuage in West Street, which is not the modern West Street of Axbridge, but rather what is now called the High Street. The modern West Street was still outside the parish of Axbridge at that time, being part of Compton Bishop. The seal is quite nice on this, showing a figure, possibly Mary, holding a child. Seals at this time, of course, would have been made of beeswax rather than the later shellac. And as you can see, they didn't crack in the way that the later seals tended to. And we'll see a few more seals as we go along. The power of the guild obviously increased with the growing number of properties endowed, which they managed, and may therefore have been one of the major reasons why they became so powerful. Here, the seal's been lost, but we can see what happens when the guild acquires a property. It's leased out on terms which reflect what exists on the plot. And here, it's a vacant plot, and John Thomas and his wife have to build a property on the site. So presumably get it for a lower rental, at least initially. In this 14th century deed, the stewards of the guild charge a rent, but also require a mass to be said in the church. This may be because it's being leased to a chaplain at the top. You may see Sir Thomas Dennis chaplain up there. And we've got 3 seals on this document. I assume that they're the Dennis family and the Mull family, who are actually referred to at the top there. And to the right is possibly the one of the guild. It's much easier to actually recognise where this property is, because it does actually say on this, between a tenement of Alice on the west and Horney's Lane on the east. Well, at the top of the High Street of Axbridge at the moment is Horn's Lane. It still exists up there, and the Red Lion pub that used to be up there is in fact a combination of this property and the one next door to it. It was a living Red Lion in living memory. Anyway, I remember it as the Red Lion at one time. It's now used solely as a house. In this case, the seals could do with a little bit of cleaning here, but otherwise are in good order. Notably, what's happened here is that you've got a lease established for 3 lives. This would become quite a common way of handling leases. 3 names would be nominated, often quite young children, because the lease remained valid whilst they still survived. It was possible, if one died, to pay a sum of money, a fine, to add an extra name. But if not, then the lease would be terminated when all 3 had died. So here, Roger, Joanna, and Alice are the 3 names on here. And when they all die, then the property reverts to the guild, unless additional names have been substituted. Later deeds don't always mention the reversion on there, but it's often stated to be a format frequently used in the 17th and 18th century. But here we are with an example in the 15th century. And this is obviously quite a good property, because you may notice down there, it does actually mention a dovecot, which would have been only on a fairly major property, presumably, an upmarket sort of property. Now, here is the will of John Lurbeck, and he expressly bequests a chaplain to celebrate an annual mass in Axbridge Church for the safety of his soul. It also gives money to be given to the poor when he's buried, and his body should be buried in the porch, which was being built at that time in Axbridge Church. There are legacies to other family members as well, but also to Wells Cathedral and the rector and chaplain of St. John the Baptist Church. Axbridge Church is St. John the Baptist Church. Nice seals here, though the first has been broken at some point. But Martin C is a name mentioned as a steward. We mentioned his name a bit earlier as well on a couple of earlier deeds. In this case, we have the names of 13 stewards on here. And again, we know which house this is. because it states that it's between the Guildhall and Nonny's Inn. Nonny's Inn up there. Must be what became the George Inn, now the George House. So Nonny's Inn is almost certainly the hairdressers in Axbridge Square today. And as this is a property in Axbridge Square, it was obviously been one of the most popular sites in the town. John and Alice Fitz are giving the property to the Guild, and it's interesting that it gives a list of the stewards here. And as you can possibly see from there, they all just list their names, except for John Hayne, and John Hayne is referred to as a tucker. And the reason for that is because if you look down the bottom there, we have a cottage of John Hayne Tanner on the west. So there are obviously a couple of people named John Tanner there, but otherwise they're not actually mentioning the names of the people on there. So there's actually an extra little bit of land on there which is being mentioned at the bottom as well. On this particular deed here, and there's two actual pieces, deeds that documents that I should be showing here, but one of these I haven't got a picture of at the moment. That's about the top one, so the one that's shown refers to the bottom one, it's quite a long thing, but you can see that it says that it acknowledges that it is to pay Thomas Stafford 40 marks, which is actually £26.13 and 8p. A mark is 2/3 of a pound, so it's not quite as much as £40 as it might sound immediately. 40 marks, but if they pay £20 and the feast of St John, the bond will be void. And here it gives 12 stewards on there, and interestingly it shows the occupation of all of them: draper, clothier, weaver, etc., etc. Most of these, you notice, are linked into the wool trade in one way or another. That's because, of course, wool was the reason in the 15th century that Axbridge became so rich. 13th to the 15th century were particular times for that. It's saying down here, acknowledgement by Thomas Stafford down the bottom, saying that if he's got the £20 there from John Fitchett, the Reeve of Axbridge. You notice at the top he is actually counted as one of the stewards, and Roger Harper also there. It's part of the 40 marks awarded in the King's Court at Westminster in an action over 2 messuages and garden of John Whaley's in Axbridge. So there's obviously a dispute here. I haven't got all of the details of that dispute on there, but you know, wherever you're talking about properties and so on, you very frequently do come into having problems about ownership between various different people and so on. So that's what's actually happening on here. Well, now, in 1467-8, and I put that in there, of course, because in today's term it would be 1468, but early in the year it would have been 1467. In those days the year actually started on Lady Day, which was March the 25th. If you're not quite sure why that's so, then if you work it out, March the 25th is 9 months away from Christmas Day, December the 25th. So Lady Day is the date of conception. And that usually start the year. But in 1752, when we changed from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, it actually moved to January the 1st. Actually, except for one thing. There was one thing that never changed. They actually, to realign themselves with the year as it should be, actually, because the years don't actually work out at 365 and a quarter days as they used to be considered. To realign itself on there, they had to lose 11 days. And if you lose 11 days from March the 25th, you actually get to April the 6th, which just happens to be the start of the tax year. And so actually that's the reason why the tax year starts on April the 6th. But anyway, the Stentar is a name presumably derived from the extent of. It's a survey for valuation purposes, we assume, of properties owned by the Guild of the Blessed Virgin Mary at that time, and list all the tenants from the east end of Axbridge right through to the west end in sequence. So it does what's today St Mary Street, and then it does the square, and then it does Moreland Street, and then it goes up the High Street, which actually is quite nice, because that means that it could be used for actually working out where a lot of these properties are. It's in medieval Latin. It actually doesn't include any rentals, funnily enough. You may notice all down the left-hand side of the document on there, it's got little sort of almost a finger pointing into the different properties that it's actually talking about on there. And it's in medieval Latin, but John Post, who I mentioned earlier, he was a former archivist at the British Library, and he kindly provided a comprehensive translation of this while he was still living in the old Guildhall in Axbridge. So it's actually a very useful document in many ways. And oh, come here. So here is the first entry, and as you can see, Richard May of Axbridge promised the rector of the Church of St John the Baptist in Axbridge and the parishioners that he'd make a great window with all appurtenances in the Guild of St Michael's Archangel in the north part of the church, ceiling and painted roof of the guild similar to or better than the roof of the guild opposite in the south part of the church. Obviously a bit of one-upmanship going on there, and also to make a pavement in the guild. And the reason for doing all that was that he wanted to get the right of burial in the Guild of St Michael for himself and his wife and his legitimate children, without hindrance of the rector and parishioners and their successors, which again says something about what was happening in the church perhaps in those sort of days. So that's an interesting one to start off with. There's a couple of others then that sort of follow on from there. And then a couple of grants, and then the will of John Moan of Crosscombe. And we've actually, in the archive, we've actually got the original will as well as the copy that appeared in the stentar there. So I've got the seal of it at the top there, and it's actually dated 1372 on there, and the actual photograph of what the will look like down at the bottom there. In there, it actually says he leaves his soul to God and the Blessed Virgin and all the saints, and his body to be buried in the Church of the Blessed Mary in Crosscombe. He leaves 10 shillings to the church wardens for his anniversary forever, an obit to be said on there. Not quite sure why he's leaving a best cow as well as 2 shillings of silver to the Fraternity of the Blessed Mary there. What the church is going to do with a cow, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, and then he leaves some money as well to the Brothers Minor in Bristol and Templegate, possibly, and the Brothers Carmel there. 20 shillings to the Molten Church and so on. But the basic thing on there, and actually the family don't seem to get terribly much on there, something to their son John, but 6pence each to their children, 6pence to the godchildren, and so on. But the thing that matters on here is 3 sites after the decease of Christina, the testator's wife, to the Brothers of the Blessed Mary of Axbridge. So Axbridge is going to do quite well out of this. And in fact, there is a record then following that, which says that it is actually passed across to them. And whenever property, here we are, we have another case here where we've got a problem with Sir Thomas Seymour on here, and John Hayne and William Cadwell, the guild stewards, the title and possession of land. So again, there's a little property on here, and little problems that occur on ownership of things on here. We've got some lovely seals on this one there. Not quite sure what the first one is there, but we've obviously then got a bull probably in the middle there and a spread eagle in the end one. But it seems that in this particular case, the stewards actually are successful on this. But Sir Thomas is to be paid 10 marks, £3, 3 and 8 pence, and his name is to be entered in the church roll to be prayed for in perpetuity. That's something we'll come back to in a bit, in a short while, actually. Now, I did actually have a look through the stentar there and try to assess the type of properties that had been left to them to actually say chantries and obits, which are basically annual chantries on there. Chantries tend to be the ones that are more frequent than that. And as you can see from this, the major things on there are tenements in the borough, 25 of those, and outside the borough in the West Street. Right, we've got I'm going a bit froggy there. We've got 5 there in West Street outside the borough. Some of those are with gardens, some of them without, and some of them just refer to curtilages on there. Then oddly, there's a couple that are mentioned surely just as cottages, quite why the difference as opposed to a tenement on there, presumably just the style of the place. Only one shop mentioned, which actually does seem to suggest that at this period in time, most of the shops are effectively in the square, in the stalls in the square, rather than actually in buildings. Later on, I can remember actually back in the 70s, that Axbridge had over 40 shops, mainly along the around the market and up the high street. But at this time, there seem to be very few of them. And a house on the town pound, that today is actually the car park in Moreland Street. Quite why the house on the town pound is particularly there, I'm not quite sure. But then it has some meadows, and some of those are mentioned in Axbridge, 1 in Cheddar and 2 in Alston. The only references to places outside Axbridge, other than the land that you mentioned in a moment in Cheddar, a bit of arable, a moiety of a close in there, that just means half a close, basically. Another close and garden, which is often referred to as a rack hay, the hay bit being a hedge. And then a couple of places in Axbridge and a couple in Cheddar, which actually just refer to land. So one of those we might actually see in a moment. Then there's a moor hay. These are areas down south of Axbridge there when you're getting more out onto the moor, and they had hedges around each of the properties. And of course, reed beds, which were very important in those days for thatching and such like. 11 shambles. Come back to that one just a moment. 1 barn, a garden with no property, quite what that one was doing, I'm not sure. A fish pond. There was a fish pond actually by the Guild Hall. Whether that is the one that's referred to on here, I'm not quite sure. And of course, a fulling and a tenter yard. And of course, fulling is actually cleaning and thickening it and then hanging it out on tenter hooks to dry. But then also on the right-hand side of here, we've got a number of things which are mentioned at the end of the stentar that just talk about rents on there. Rents of a size, a fixed rent by freeholders and copyholders. So presumably these are things that where they're getting rentals coming in from there. Not quite sure about all of this, actually. 1 house on there, quite that seems reasonable and a place. But the Tulsey, of course, the place where the tolls are collected, surely is owned by the town itself anyway, I would have thought, as is the Guild Hall owned by the stewards. But it seems to be that they're renting out some of it. Whether they're renting it out to the Burgesses as a separate thing or not, I don't know, but it does seem a little bit odd there. There's a ground, a stall or shambles. Well, actually, later on, they had about 18 shambles. At this time, I think I'm right in saying there were only about a dozen. So it looks as though 11 of those have come into their hands, but one is still owned by somebody else, but they still have to pay a rent on it. The other ones would obviously have to pay a higher rent on it, I guess. And then we've got a couple of other things on there which, well, I don't know whether anybody else knows what a land gavel and a shap gavel is. Land rent for the land gavel, perhaps. Shap gavel, is that a shop gavel? I don't really know. So those are a little bit of a puzzle on there, not quite sure what they're all about. Anyway, what I then did was to look at some properties owned by Axbridge in the 18th and 19th century, and most of the properties that they had derived from guild properties. But here you can see there were quite a number of properties located outside Axbridge which are not included in that stentar. Some of them are not even in Somerset. You see Ottery, St Mary's, Stockland in Bristol, another one in Bristol, Wootton B, I assume that's Wootton Bassett. These are the reason that they're like that actually is because of problems in the document itself, holes in the document or something. Stowith, I'm not quite sure where that is. It sounds like it should be in Wales somewhere. And Honeybridge and Warminster in Wilts. But if you look at the Somerset ones there, then many of the places there are from villages not too far away from Axbridge, Barrow, Bidisham, Chapel Allerton, Cheddar, Compton, Bishop, Loxton, Limpsham, and so on, right the way up to Wirral on there. South Brent is included on there, which is, of course, Brent Knoll, which is where I'm living at the moment. So I don't know whether that means that the stentar is just listing the properties in Axbridge and that there is something else at the time, perhaps, which listed the others, or exactly what that's all about on there. Whoops. Whoops, sorry. Went over two then. So here, what I then did was to have a look at some of the guild accounts which we have in the 15th century. And one of these actually, David Bromwich did actually transcribe some of these, one of these for me some years ago, which was very nice of him. And so the ones I'm showing here are actually from the one that he transcribed. As you can see on here, there are 5 pages of payments, outgoing payments that they made at this particular time. But noticeably, those ones over on the left-hand side there where it's bracketed are the only obits mentioned. And I'm not quite sure what's happened to all of the other payments that presumably they should be paying for obits or chantries being the prayers being said on there. There is an amount at the top which actually pays £6 to the priest for a year, but that seemed to be something that was supplementing the priest's money anyway, and they were still doing that in the 19th century. So I'm not quite sure whether that's anything to do with that specifically. And there's also something for John Fitchett for keeping of the organ. In another place, actually, there's even a lovely account of a blind man who actually is paid for looking after the church clock, which is quite an interesting thought. But most of the payments actually shown in there actually do relate to either things in the church, and I'll have a look at some of those again in just a moment. But a lot of them actually refer to work being done on the houses that they owned. There is, on the other hand, one item on there which I happen to notice that a gallon of wine to the suffragan bishop, the diocese head. So he obviously does quite nicely out of this as well. Anyway, here, this property may be one of those that's referenced as land in the stentar, because if you notice on this one here, it does actually say that they are going to build the house on the site on there, tenement or burglary newly built by them on there, so it may easily have been one of the lands earlier on there. I'm not quite sure actually as to what sort of place it is. I'm hoping that this is only the homes, because you notice that John Hayne Tanner on one side and sorry, John Ewan Tanner on one side and John Hayne Tanner on the other side. If it's Tanner's Works on both sides, it might be a bit of a smelly place to live in. But anyway, perhaps it is just their home rather than their workplace. Here there's a set of guild account books. Little has been done on these, but they obviously provide a lot of information about the tenants of the guild properties over many years, and also of the stewards of the guild. And it could also show how rents have changed over time, what the guild was spending its money on, and so on and so forth. And here we've got the list of names and the sums of money. They go on there. The stewards are listed on there. So we've got a record of all the stewards over many, many years on there. And there's actually, funnily enough, there's a guy called John Boucher down there. Just recently, a couple have moved in next door whose name's Boucher. So next door to me, which is quite interesting there. There's a page of obits, and that actually is still not a lot of obits on there. There's also various other bits and bobs in there which can be quite interesting. So here we've got something with John Boucher on there, but as you can see, paintings of Our Lady's Isle, payments to priests, payments of chief rents, and here a list of obits. There's one or two more than the 6 that we had previously, but still not a lot of them, as you would expect normally to find. One of the things I find interesting is that the list of obits on there, on both the previous one and this one on here, include obits for the burgesses and the stewards, or brothers as they sometimes get called. They differentiate that at various different times, but they actually refer to obits being said for themselves, basically. Here's a later set of accounts, slightly later set of account, and as you can see from this one, some of the details of some of the payments you'd expect from a chantry guild on here. Payments for an altar cloth, repairs to houses owned by the guild, mending the lady chapel, wax candles for the priest, a friar to sing mass, carriage of reed to Taunton, making window list of obits, mending a branch before Our Lady of Pity, cleaning candlesticks, investments, altar cloths, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole load of things here that I'm not quite sure what prickets for the Assumption and Nativity Our Lady are, but anyway, there's, as you can see, lots of things for timber, lime, reeds, tiled stones, all the rest of it for building work and so on, a list of arrears and chief rents and to the portrait. So a whole load of things that, the sort of things that you would expect on there. But then came the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. And this was followed by an Act of Parliament which stated that the Chantries represented misapplied funds and misappropriated lands, which may have been actually quite true in some cases, in Axbridge particularly, and said that all chantries and their properties would now belong to the King, Henry VIII, as long as he should live. Well, he died 2 years later, so very few chantries were taken over, but his successor, Edward VI, in 1547, created a new act, and that took over 2,374 chantries, guild chapels, and their assets. Many were sold to private citizens, but in Axbridge, it appears that the burgesses were the ones who were interested in acquiring the chantry assets. There was a problem, though. if they purchased them as individuals, that would be fine. But to do so as a body, they needed to be a corporate entity. That required a royal charter. And here is the royal charter, which they actually acquired. Probably cost a lot of money, of course. And it's rather odd that it should actually have been acquired in the reign of King Philip and Queen Mary. Queen Mary, of course, being Mary Tudor, actually wanted to reinstate the Catholic religion, but still seems to have given them a charter to actually get rid of the Chantries. But you notice on this that at the top of the charter on the right-hand side, it does say Philippus et Maria, Rex et Regina, King and Queen. And in the capital on the left over there, you can see them both holding the sword of state and the scepter, and the crown is actually hovering between them. It would have been interesting, wouldn't it, that if in fact Mary had lived a little bit longer or had a baby by Philip, then that would have changed the whole history of Europe quite dramatically. But anyway, it didn't happen that way. He actually went off on the continent. Actually was a bit dissolute, I gather, around on the continent. And she, of course, died very young, and they wouldn't let him return to become King of England. So anyway, there we are. That's the charter that they got, and that would allow them now to be corporate, and therefore to actually be able to hold the properties. This transcript from the charter, the original being in Latin, clearly shows that they have the corporate status, and it specifically says they can possess lands, tenements, etc. And it does say the inhabitants of the borough, but then says the mayor and burgesses. So here we've got the name of the mayor and burgesses up on the right at the top, shall have perpetual succession, and that they by the same name may and shall be persons able and capable in law to have, purchase, receive, hold and possess lands, tenements, etc. But on the left-hand side at the bottom, the inhabitants of the same borough may and shall be one body, corporate and politic. That actually is a point of contention that is going to come up shortly. And here, it changed many ways of doing things, but here, of course, is actually a book which is the start of the Burgess's book after the Reformation on there, and it does actually there say the same year Peter Welsh Portreeve, you have to say this in Somerset, Portreeve, and ended mayor. Thomas Hill, William Brady Constables, Clement Bourne, Daly, the same year our corporation was granted, and the 8th day of February our charter was proclaimed at G Market Cross. So there we are, very proudly presenting that one on there. It actually changed many ways of doing things. So actually the 32 burgesses became important again rather than the stewards on there. There were 14 aldermen defined within it on there, a mayor, a bailiff, constables and various other people there that actually would do various different administrative jobs around the town. And they were to be elected according to custom on this. Here we've got the seals from both of these. So on the left, the seal on there shows them king and queen sitting on their thrones dispensing justice. And on the right-hand side, they're on horseback defending the realm of the country, defending the realm. And notably, he's in the front, she's behind, and she, of course, is riding side saddle, as you would expect at that sort of period of time. We should probably be able to see from the accounts how this one, how that was all paid for. Unfortunately, that's one of the things we don't have. The last of the guild accounts was from 1548 to 49, and the new set of accounts for the Chamberlain under the corporation didn't start till 1642, and then that was only for a year, and then it's not until 1694 that the accounts exist. So why don't we have those accounts on there? And the only reason I can assume on there is either they've got lost at some point, somebody's borrowed them and not returned them, or something of that sort, which is feasible. But it's also possible, as we shall see in a while, that in fact they are purposely disposed of because they show some use of money that shouldn't have been used for various different purposes and such like. I'll come back to mention that one a little bit later on. Anyway, here we have this rent roll does survive from that sort of the first year when the charter was granted, but it only shows the person's name and rent paid, and sort of what type of property it was, whether it was a house or later on whether it was a shambles. And no other rentals still exist for this period, and no outgoings are shown, so we can't be exactly certain what did happen on there. Later, two additional royal charters were required. The first of those in 1599 under Elizabeth I. Basically, seems the first charter was done in a bit of a hurry, and because of that, they didn't actually get all of the administration set up properly. So the Elizabethan charter is really about enhancing the regulations of the corporation. And then later on, they got a charter in 1623 under James I, which did modify a few more regulations, but only a few. But really, the major objective of that one is that they were having a major problem because part of the charters actually gave them authority to have their own courts. And so most of the things, murder and such like wasn't included, but thieving and such like was, they could actually have their own courts on that. The only problem was that it was only for Axbridge. And at that time, what is today the West Street of Axbridge was Incompton Bishop. So anybody mucking about in the square could then leg it up High Street into what's now West Street and couldn't be touched. So this charter of 1623 actually made sure that they actually increased the extent of their courts and increased right the way up to including the West Street of Axbridge. So here, these accounts from 1727, they may not be totally representative of all that happened, but it is one I just picked out at random, just to see the sort of things that was happening. And as you can see, the total on this particular page came to £15.18 and sixpence. And the total of the amount of that on beer and liquor was £9 and ninepence. So the money that has been left over for this does seem to be mainly going on beer and liquor and various other nice things for the burgesses themselves. Most of that is actually for the burgesses. Occasionally, something does get paid for builders or something like that, where they give them a little supplement for beer and so on. But later on, there are other things which actually are feasting and things like that as well, which appear in there. It does include things like street maintenance, clearing greens, paying for repairs to houses and that sort of thing. But obviously, the citizens didn't have rates charged in those days. So they actually were doing reasonably all right on there, but the burgesses were certainly using most of the money and controlling it. Now, various disputes did occur during the centuries on there, but what I want to go on is jump over a little bit of time on there to get up to the time when Hannah More came around to Cheddar and Axbridge and so on, because this is when a major dispute actually occurred. And in this case, as you can see, the Lamb of Axbridge is their sort of symbol. So Axbridge divided here. And it was around this sort of time that, as it says on here, Mr. G, whenever Hannah More is being rude about anybody, she always just puts their initial on there. But in fact, she is referring to the Reverend Gould. He was civil to us and attended us to several of the corporation who were of his party. The town being all anarchy and malice, and pretty equally divided in enmity. However, our cause compelled us to be equally civil and attentive to each party. Reverend Gould was definitely a rogue. I do a talk about him as well, actually, but he was up to all sorts of things and caused a lot of problems in Axbridge while he was there. But in fact, here is that was her sister who actually wrote that previous one. In here, actually, this one, Mr. G, again, is actually a letter from Hannah More herself. And the living of Axbridge belongs to the prebendary of Wiveliscombe in the Cathedral of Wells. The annual value is about £50, incumbent about 60 years of age. The prebend to which this rectory belongs is in the gift of the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Mr. G is intoxicated about 6 times a week and is very frequently prevented from preaching by 2 black eyes honestly earned by fighting. So you can see the enmity in the town is quite a lot. Actually, interesting, intoxicated about 6 times a week. Of course, nobody drank water in those days. They drank beer and cider because you didn't trust the water. In fact, a lot of the water down that sort of way still was contaminated with lead from Mendip. So you didn't want to drink that for a certainty. And but it's in the Axbridge pageant, they tend to say that his black eyes were earned by affairs he had with somebody's wife. But in fact, it's not. It's more to do with the sort of problems that we're talking about here, actually. And then we're talking about a middle-aged man, a character they know nothing. The curate is a sober young man. So this is just sort of a few little extra comments there. But here at this time, there is a protest by the inferior burgesses. There were 9 superior burgesses, of which the mayor and chamberlain, alderman, sorry, there's only 1 alderman at this time. If you remember, there were 14 of them before. It's now down to 1. And so 12 of the inferior burgesses, there weren't 32 at this time. They're only just sort of sometime in the something in the low 20s. John, so the 12 signed it. John Jervis added Mark and his seal, but 4 others were actually missing from here. So obviously the controversy is going between all of these sort of people. We're not quite sure exactly what they're doing, but this is dated from 1793, just a few years after the More sisters arrived. They came to Cheddar in 1789 and moved into Axbridge just a year or so later than that. But they actually are signing this on there, and what they're complaining about is that the mayor, aldermen and capital burgesses of Axbridge, that's the superior or capital burgesses, are very much involved in debt by lawsuits from private quarrels and animosities. And whereas they mean to demise and grant the lands and premises belonging to the corporation without the consent and approbation of the above bound and free burgesses of the borough at Axbridge, aforesaid gentlemen, who said they have an equal right with the said mayor and capital burgess of disposing of the corporation lands. If you remember that charter we had earlier, which actually suggested that it was the inhabitants of Axbridge rather than just the burgesses, but even then, these are burgesses. They've agreed to oppose such intended sale, and the debts contracted should be paid by the mayor, aldermen, and capital burgesses with their private money. The mayor, aldermen, and capital burgesses have for many years past trampled upon the free burgesses' rights, liberties, and privileges. And this week they elected a mayor of the said borough without their consent and approbation. Well, it's probably quite accurate, actually. Oops, where are we? Anyway, oh yes, that's just doing on there. Anyway, Levi West, the attorney, who actually became a Burgess later, was to commence and prosecute an action in His Majesty's Court of King's Bench in our corporate names against Richard Axon for unlawfully taking away a streamer, which was our property. Actually, we still have the streamers, or in Axbridge. We're hoping, or banners as we call them nowadays, and we're hoping actually to get that actually sorted out shortly, because they're in a bit of a state. We hope to have them redone, so they're looking really nice. But there's a load of other lawsuits on this that actually were being done at this sort of time, and we'll come to some of those in just a moment. Where are we? So here are some of the receipts in 1787, and you can see from this that in fact the most of the income that they have in the town is coming from the rents and fines from those properties which were handed over. I'm actually worrying about the time on there, yes. Oh dear. Come on. I've got a little thing that keeps on coming in the way at the bottom here, screen sharing, it says. But anyway, what they wanted to do was put these lands on 1,000-year leases, and here we've got some examples showing some of those leases being started up, because they did actually do that, so they actually would sell those and get a lot of money. The sort of money we're talking about here, as you can see down the bottom left on there, some of the costs that are involved in the lawsuits that they were doing, and we're talking in £432 in total on there. A heck of a lot of money for court cases in London. In those days, that would be an enormous amount of money today. Here we are, John Crease, who was one of those who didn't sign the thing on there. He was getting himself a lease. And on the back of it, on the reverse side of it, as shown on the right there, is some things on there which actually are a list of the things that they are putting on the leases to show, whoops, these things here. They're actually showing on there the really important one. If any suits against common council, they shall be indemnified by common person the distribution of the corporation. So they're trying to prove on the back that the superior burgesses are allowed to do all of this. So here we are. There was a report of municipal things in 1835, and it appears that only a small part was sold by public auction, great deal by private contract. And it does say on there that there's, where are we? Only one lot was sold to a member of the corporation, and most of it was sold in those sort of periods when we're talking about 1400 was received in those 2 years. But if in fact I look at the 1,000-year ones sold, only one was sold to the corporation. Well, look, here we are, mayor, alderman, free burgess, superior burgess or capital burgess. Most of them were actually sold to them rather than to the private individuals as stated there. And then that was for doing that. And then later on in 1828-30, they actually sold most of the rest on 1,000-year leases to build the town hall. But it actually overran and they were left with quite a debt. So a Municipal Corporations Act on here, it was said that the borough funds were frequently expended in feasting and all that sort of thing, and municipal property also treated as if it were only for the use of the corporation and not the general population. Here we are, a report on there in 1876, which eventually led to the loss of the borough status for Axbridge, because it was considered that they were basically cheating all of the town all of the time. And that's why one of the reasons why we haven't got any of their accounts. In fact, they actually complained in a report about Axbridge that, in fact, they were not shown the accounts, even though they had demanded them. But it did actually, it's finally on there, it actually, because they're on 1,000-year leases, it actually meant that Axbridge didn't have many voters, because you had to have £50 a year, and many of those leases were actually for less than that. So if the value of the property was not sufficient, then you didn't actually get a vote. So that actually diminished the number of votes. You can see Cheddar has twice the population, but over 4 times the number of voters on there. So there, as you can see, the what's happened on there is that there's been quite a lot of skullduggery going on in Axbridge there. I think it's probably true to say that in the 17th and 18th century, they are definitely what we would classify as a third world country style nowadays. It has been that the legacy has caused a lot of controversy in the town. Most of the 1,000-year leases have now been turned into freeholds, and the last 1 or 2 remaining, as I said, I had one last week coming up, that will be changed, because in the 1960s the ground rent on them actually became so little that it was costing more to collect it than it was to actually the money they actually got in. So there we are. That's the end of my talk. I'm sorry I've overrun a bit.
Goodness me, John. Those documents were quite spectacular, really. And you say that you had them actually in Axbridge till quite recently.
They were actually in the town hall in Axbridge, yes, in a box in a chest in the town hall. Some of the charters were actually in a safe. They were put there only in the 19th century, mind you. But in fact, I did discover that some of them were being written on for notes for talks and things like that. So
Yeah.
I actually decided that the best thing to do was to get them down to Taunton in the record office, and they have been very good there, because what they have done is to actually put a record. So if you look online, you can actually have a look at the records in the Axbridge archive now.
Oh, fantastic. But it does sound as though it was quite...
should be mentioned. I should mention Sue Berry there, who was a retired archivist, because she sat down over 2 or 3 years and actually did that for free, which was very, very good of her.
Absolutely. It's always amazing how much people care about these things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it sounds like Axbridge was quite a good place to be if you're a Burgess, then. You're having a good time.
If you were a capital Burgess, certainly, as you can see, the inferior Burgesses, I mean, quite often, actually, what you would find is that you were supposed to become an inferior Burgess before you become a capital Burgess. But quite a lot of times, if you were an important enough person, you would become an inferior Burgess and a capital Burgess on the same day. That wasn't supposed to happen, but it did frequently happen.
Very hard, isn't it? I find it quite hard to get a handle, really, on what is going on. It's so long ago, and the way of doing things is quite different, really. And some of the words don't mean very much to me. I couldn't work out, what is a porreeve?
A portreeve.
A portreeve, sorry.
A portreeve, yes. Port means town, and a
Right.
reeve is actually somebody who acts on behalf of the lord of the manor.
Right.
So they would actually be doing the Frank Pledge, which basically was a little bit of legal stuff where you had a 10 people tithing, where 10 people were supposed to look after anyone in their group who was and pay compensation for anyone in their group who was doing things that they shouldn't be doing. and so on. And they have a court every year that they would hold for this sort of thing. So they had that earlier on before they actually got their charter and sorted out their ability to do it the other way around.
Okay, so just as again, like I say, it's hard to get a handle on quite what was going on. So people were giving money to the church for, or pieces of land to the church, so that they could presumably rent it out and get money for it, and that paid the priest. Am I correct, or am I
Yes,
just
you are.
making that up?
That is what's supposed to be happening, but as
Yes.
far as we can see on there, the money seems to have been used for maintaining the church initially and so on, but we haven't got very much about them actually doing the obits and the chantries as such on there.
Okay. What is an obit then? Is that
An
just like
obit is, yeah, an obit is basically an annual prayers for the soul, whereas a chantry would be a more regular one. I mean,
ah,
if you were the King of England, you would actually set up a monastery where all the priests would be, all the monks would be praying for your soul. You could do it on a big scale to get up to heaven very fast that way. But if you were rather poorer, you might only do it once a year, and but it would help you on your way.
that's always nice to know, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Oh dear. Well, thank you for that, John. There's so much in there. It would take quite a lot of unpacking, but I was extremely pleased to be able to see those documents. They're most interesting. And yeah, thank you very much indeed for a really interesting talk. Okay, then. So we have a few events coming up next for SANHS. Our next webinar will be on the 27th of March, and that will be David Victor, who will be talking about John Perriam, who was a steward of Milverton. Now, most importantly, SANHS is having an exhibition in Taunton Library. That will be on the 3rd to the 7th of March. It's free to get in, and there will be quite an interesting display talking about the history of SANHS to celebrate its 175 years. And to top that up, off on the 8th of March, really important and a really good fun thing to be happening in the Wyndham Hall, we'll be having a series of talks. I think we've got about 20 people giving short, very short lectures, all about the history of what SANHS, when SANHS was begun in 1849. We wanted to talk about what Somerset was like at that time. So that's £18 to get in, but that covers your lunch as well. That's the 8th of March. On the 11th of March, it's a busy old time, the Wyndham Picture House will be showing Cinema Paradiso. That's usually on a Tuesday evening. Now, something not SANHS, on the 19th of March, the Somerset Vernacular Buildings Research Group, or SOVBURG, is having a talk in Somerton about tithe barns. That's the 19th of March. And on the 22nd of March, back to SANHS again, there will be a talk on the life of the Damsel and Dragonfly by John Wolfe Jowler. That's the Wyndham Hall on the 27th of March at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. For all these events, just go and have a look on the SANHS website, and they're all there in detail. Okay, so that all remains for me to do is to say thank you for the webinar team, Nathanael, Allan and Tony, and thank you for joining us again tonight. We hope we'll see you all at the next webinar on the 27th of March. So thank you and good night.